What's the difference between the mean and median? Well, they're both measures of central tendency, which just means they describe and quantify the center of a data set, allowing us to summarize a lot of numbers with just a single number. The difference lies in how they describe that center. The median is quite literally the middle value. Line up all the data points in order from smallest to largest, the median is the number right in the middle. Or in some cases, if the middle is two values, we just take their average. The mean works differently. It's more like a balance point or center of mass. Imagine a bar with weight evenly spread across it. It balances in the middle. But if we place an additional heavy weight to one side, the balance point would shift towards that side. Data works the same way. If values are spread out symmetrically, the mean and median are close together, like a bar balanced perfectly in the middle. But if our data has extreme values, they pull the mean closer toward them. This skews the mean away from the median. If the mean is pulled to the right of the median, we call this a right-skewed distribution. And if the mean is skewed to the left of the median, we call this a left-skewed distribution. The TLDR, the median is the literal middle value when the data is ordered. The mean is the balance point where the weight is evenly distributed on both sides.